It's my distinct pleasure to bring you a conversation with Dr. Louis Markos. Lou is a professor of English and a scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. Lou is an author of 18 books and a contributor to the Christian Research Journal, CRI's flagship publication. And we're pleased to be offering his latest book, Atheism on Trial, to listeners like you who are supporting the ongoing work of the Christian Research Institute. If you'd like to learn more about joining the CRI support team and equipping yourself and others with essential tools like Lou's book, Atheism on Trial, simply head to equip.org. Lou, having truly feasted on your book, Atheism on Trial, it's great to get a chance to talk to you. Thanks for taking time out from what I know is a busy schedule to join us today.
Thanks, Larry. It's great to be here.
Lou, as you know certainly better than most, critics and skeptics for 2 millennia have been putting Christianity on trial. And like other serious Christian scholars over the century, you've decided to return the favor and put atheism on trial. And what's cool is that you have invited us all to take our place in the jury box as you do so.
I think it's about time. We've been on the defensive so often. I think we need to go on the offensive, not to be offensive, but to understand that we have a worldview that is more integrated and coherent than any other worldview out there. And we do not have to be ashamed of the gospel, either in an emotional, spiritual way or in a logical, rational way. We have the worldview, and we need to be unashamed and to come forward and speak up for it.
Amen. Having really genuinely benefited from your book, and one that I'll no doubt be reading more than once, I have a boatload of questions for you, and can we dive right in?
Let's dive in.
Terrific. In your introduction, you note that the modernist story portrays human civilization as a staircase that begins in darkness, ignorance, superstition, and barbarism, and ever so slowly ascends toward light, truth, science, secular humanism. I'm guessing that you have a problem with that narrative.
I do, and the problem is that this narrative has been fed to us so much that we don't even realize it is a constructed narrative. We have just taken for granted that this is somehow true. This is the way that things are and have been for the last 1,000 of years. But this is a modern construct. It's only as old as the Enlightenment, and really it's even less old than that in terms of the general public. We have been convinced, and I mean Christians now, Christians, we who believe the revelation of the Scripture, who believe that Christ is risen from the dead, without realizing it, like a fish in water, without realizing it, we have imbibed this notion that at the core of history is this thing called progress, that things naturally get better and better, that people get smarter and smarter, and that every time we have a new development, it somehow makes all the things before it wrong. C.S. Lewis came to call this chronological snobbery. The idea, 2 ideas. One is that if something is newer, it must be better. But deeper than that, what chronological snobbery means is if modern civilization no longer believes in something, let's say miracles, that must be because it was disproved by someone at some point. But guess what? That's not true. A lot of the things we no longer believe, I mean, the secular society no longer believes, they just stopped believing it. They may have thought they disproved it, but they didn't. They just stopped believing it and convinced themselves, and to a certain extent even believers, that all that old, quote, medieval stuff is old and has somehow been superseded by new developments in science or technology or psychology or anthropology or philosophy or whatever it is. But the fact of the matter is, these things, the tenets of Christianity, have not been disproven. They've just been moved beyond by people who have other motives. We may talk about those motives later. But the narrative is simply not true. We've imbibed it, we think it's true, but it's not. our world has not created a genius on the level of, say, Aquinas or Dante or Aristotle or Augustine. Just because it's newer doesn't mean it's better.
Yes, some stories, like the modernist story, become not just narratives, but meta-narratives. What's the distinction between narrative and meta-narrative, and what is the significance of stories achieving a meta-narrative status?
It's a good question. A narrative, of course, is just any story. But a meta-narrative is the controlling story. Now, as Christians, we do have a meta-narrative, and that meta-narrative is the story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. That is the overarching story of which we are a part, going back to Adam and Eve, to the fall, to Christ, and looking forward to the second coming when there will be a new heaven and a new earth. That is the meta-narrative. Meta means over, like metaphysics. That's the meta-narrative, the overarching narrative into which all other stories fit. Well, what the modern world has done is given us a new meta-narrative, and that's if there's one word, it's the word evolution. It is the idea that all things evolve, not just in terms of Darwin's idea of species evolving, but that everything evolves and somehow gets better, and everything else, like Christianity, gets left on the ash heap of history. So a meta-narrative means that this is your essential story, this is your essential truth, and everything else must be fit into that. Let me give you another example of a simple meta-narrative. From a Christian point of view, the meta-narrative says that everything begins in the spiritual realm and works its way down into the physical realm. In the beginning, God. Everything is spiritual in the beginning, and out of that comes the physical. Not so the modern meta-narrative, which completely flips that on its head and says the origin of everything is matter, nature, physical things, and out of that evolve spiritual things. Or to put it in a simple way, God did not create man in the Christian meta-narrative. Man ultimately created God in the modernist meta-narrative.
Yeah, you touched on this briefly in passing, but I think it was the philosopher Santayana who said, I'm not sure entirely who it was that first discovered water, but I know it wasn't a fish. Kind of by way of analogy, this speaks to what you touched on, that like water to fish, we live within these meta-narratives so much that we're totally unaware of them. Lou, in your book, you've spent a fair amount of time addressing the contributions of a lot of different philosophers to some of the critical issues that we're discussing. But for those folks who weren't philosophy majors, when you talk about the pre-Socratic philosophers, who were the pre-Socratics, and in what sense were they evolutionists 2,000 years before Darwin?
Great. And let's talk about this, because the whole point of my book is that the new atheists want us to believe that they've come up with all these new arguments that will knock out Christianity for good. What I argue, and not just argue, but demonstrate by quoting the people, is that these arguments have been around for 2,600 years. And it really starts with a group of people called the pre-Socratic philosophers. They're called pre-Socratic because they come between 50 and 150 years before Socrates, starting about 600 BC. They have names like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes and Parmenides and Pythagoras and then Heraclitus, lots of different names. And these pre-Socratics, we don't have any books from them. What we have are fragments that are quoted by, say, Plato or Aristotle or Cicero or later people. So you can't buy a full book by one of these people, but you can buy a book of pre-Socratic philosophy and look at the various fragments that have been preserved. But we have enough preserved that we can understand the basic arguments they were writing. And yes, they were the first evolutionists. They decided, first of all, to stop asking questions like who and why. Those are the questions that religious people tend to ask. Who, pointing to God, why, motivation. And they said all we care about is what and how. We want sort of technical, programmatic answers. We're not interested in ultimate origins. We're just interested in the nature of things and how it works. And many of these pre-Socratics were evolutionists in the sense that they believed that at the core of everything was not spirit, but at the core of everything was matter. What a lot of people don't understand till they start reading old books is that the Bible is absolutely unique by beginning in the beginning God. It's not just in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Those 4 words are absolutely revolutionary. In the beginning God. Because in every other ancient book, whether you're looking at Greek mythology, Roman, Norse, Egyptian, Native American, whenever you go back and look at their stories, it's always not in the beginning God, but in the beginning stuff, in the beginning matter. The Greeks had a word for it that's come directly into our language. That word is chaos. And the word chaos means undifferentiated matter. And they believe that this is true of every ancient myth, including what I'm going to be calling the myth of evolution, that in the beginning, all there was matter floating around, and just randomly by chance, that matter slowly evolved into all the things that we know. And guess what? Not only did we, human beings, come out of the matter, if they believed in gods, they believed that the gods came out of the matter as well. In the beginning is matter, not God, not spirit, but stuff. And they, the pre-Socratics, probably the best way we know them today is they're the ones that started talking about how everything was composed of the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. That idea goes right on through the Renaissance, almost into the Enlightenment, used in different ways. But they were interested in finding the physical, material, natural building blocks of things. And even if they did believe in the gods, they found them irrelevant in terms of explanation or science. They just sort of left them on the side and argued. Now, the most fascinating of all was a man named Epicurus, the founder of Epicureanism, and he and his famous poet heir, a man named Lucretius, who wrote in the 1st century BC, they had a really kind of cool idea. They were called atomists. Now, an atom, that's a Greek word that means cannot be divided. So an atom is the smallest unit of matter. And what the atomists, like Epicurus and Lucretius, believed is that everything in the universe is composed of either an atom, a little bit of matter, or space, a void. That's all there is. These atoms moving through empty space, what they called the void, and they just moved on randomly. And every so often, for no reason, one of them swerved and hit another one. And out of that swerve comes everything that we know. It's basically evolution. It's a view of the world that's binary. Everything's a 1 or a 0, and out of the random dance of those atoms comes everything that we know. So again, this idea that everything we see around us could have arrived here merely through physical, natural processes and time and chance was in no way invented by Darwin or the evolutionists of the 19th century. That's been around with us for at least 2,600 years and has been debated for that long. And it's never been proven, of course.